Now, thank you for joining us on the show today, Susan. As listeners or viewers would have heard in your bio, there is a lot in your career that we could sink our teeth into today, but you're on Mod TV to talk about our theme of disruption. And so we're pleased to chat about your work in relation to this theme. But maybe we could start with you telling us about how you came about your research at UniSA and what you are currently focusing on.
Okay, thanks very much for that. As you said in my introduction there, my principal area of interest is looking at the worlds and the workplaces and patterns of cultural and creative workers. I haven't gone back into this for a while, but I actually came to this through rave culture, which
Mm,
ironically in this moment of disruption because of COVID's having a second life. As illegal parties become a new way of people connecting together when possibly they shouldn't always be, but the will to want to do that is obviously there. I did a PhD on rave culture in Australia, and one of the interesting things was that while that was largely underground, a lot of really important research and development around the staging of events,
mhm,
fashion, even things like everything through from hairstyling through to body modification, and especially obviously music was happening in this
mm,
space. Things that then went off into a more mainstream world of cultural and creative industries and became multi-billion-dollar international industries. So I was really interested in the way that small-scale practice, even when it seems like it's outside of contemporary economies and the mainstream world, is actually a really important part of where new ideas happen, where research and development happens, and where the
mm,
futures can start to be seen, or potential futures. So this is translated into my more recent research. A lot of work into the cultural and creative industries is interested in statistics. Where are people working? What do they do? What industries? Blah, 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 blah. And that's great. And I work with those too. But they might tell you how many and where and what they do, but they don't tell you why. It doesn't
mm,
tell you how they got there. It doesn't tell you where they think they're going or they would like to go. And so I complement, and one of my strengths, I suppose, of my research, and one of the more original parts of it is the way I've used research interviews and field work to just go out and actually talk to people, to put flesh on the bones of those
mm,
kinds of stories. And the other thing I'll say about that methodology, even though I don't want to bore people with research talk, that's important for disruptions is, for example, in Australia, when we have the census, which is often the main way we get data about people's work, we only ask about one piece of work. We only assume that people have one major source of income.
mm,
So there's huge problems now with the data collection in this country because even before COVID, the reality was, and especially for people entering the workforce, that you don't just have one job, maybe you could have multiple jobs. You have what's called a
mm,
portfolio career, especially in the arts and creative industries where
mhm,
you want to work in one sector, but you've got to put together, hospitality work and working in retail, and that's in the creative sector or whatever. And you
mm,
put together that portfolio of work to sustain you. Our data doesn't capture that at all.
mm.
And the model that presumes that we've all got one job that we all go off to is just completely outdated. So that's another reason for having a methodology and going out and talking to people to try and actually capture the reality rather than what neatly tries to get packaged in statistics.
Mhm.
Mm. That hits very close to home for
I was
me as
gonna say
a
that too.
as an arts and creative industries worker, because I think in the last tax year I would have had 4 or 5 different places of income,
Mhm,
just purely because of that reason. Yeah,
mm.
it's
That's absolutely right.
And it can be feast or famine. Even some of the most successful people in, for example, the screen industries, you're either on a gig or you're off. And when you're
Mm,
on, you're working 24/7 almost. When you're off, you're off. So if the census just happens on a week or a time when you're working full time, or when it comes when you're in between contracts, that completely blows the statistics. And once again, just doesn't really represent what's really going on out there.
mm,
as well as it sounds like your kind of focus on qualitative data as well as that kind of census quantitative research data collection sounds like a very important part of understanding kind of the complexity of the industry as well, or the industries. Um, so yeah, that sounds really fascinating, as well as, you know, um, kind of subcultures like rave and other kind of underground cultures and how they've kind of influenced more mainstream kind of cultural expressions over the years. That's really, yeah, there's so much in there. Um, But I might continue by asking you, Susan, in what ways do you think the disruption of the last few months has affected the cultural and creative sector?
Yeah.
Probably lots of ways.
Yeah, I think I don't need to, I'm not any particular unique expert in this space. I think we can all see, and many people are probably, including yourselves, are experiencing what this is actually like. The cultural and creative sectors, the arts, have been profoundly impacted, as we know. In fact, they're probably up there beyond hospitality and somewhere near tourism in terms of the industries that just had to stop short in many instances. Certainly, live performances had to stop. We've had a little bit of a return to those, but not really. Theatres had to stop. Famously, The Mousetrap, which has been the longest running theatre play in the West End in London, I think it's been going for 67 years or something, has had to stop because, world wars didn't stop it pretty much, but this has stopped it. It's just blown everything out of the water largely. The galleries closed, the museums closed, screen production shut down. I'm sure that some sort of games companies could potentially work from home if people could have the software on their computers and enough bandwidth to do it. But on the whole, we saw the music industry shut down, and just it's absolutely been hammered by COVID and continues to be. A lot of these institutions and organisations are still just starting to think about ways that they can open up. In what it's the one thing I will say, I was about to say you can't do takeout galleries, but you can do takeout arts and culture. And I might be preempting some of the discussion to come. But one of the other things, though, that did happen was that when we all had to race home or be locked down at home, so many of us raced to arts and culture for the thing we wanted and we needed to keep us sane. So I think one of the other big challenges here is that there have been wonderful ways in which so much of what was previously done face-to-face in the physical world has gone online. The work that you're doing there at Mod is one wonderful example of that. But for those people who, I'm thinking in particular of musicians and some of the performers, for those people who have had to effectively put online and stream for free things that we used to pay for, there's real challenges as we move forward as to how we're going to go back to actually providing an income stream for people when we've actually gotten accustomed to seeing world-class, for example, stage performances that have been released by the companies to keep interest going in the companies and their work. But if we can get it for free, why would we want to pay for it? And this has long been a challenge for music and musicians, but it's been even more exacerbated by the shutdown and by the shift to online, which in the first few months of COVID was a bit of a novelty and a good idea and something we valued. But as it becomes the new normal, the business models underpinning this once again have been disrupted, and the arts and creative sector have got a challenge ahead about how to bring money back into that.
That's such an interesting point, that how moving things online has kind of increased access kind of exponentially, particularly to arts and culture, like you're saying, but then, managing expectations for people, for, audiences around, keeping artists fed and paid and, that's a really interesting challenge. I hadn't actually thought of post-COVID.
Yeah, and hopefully one of the things that the shutdown might do is, this is me being optimistic, is that it will give people that hunger to see things in the flesh again. And when they're able to, they will seize that opportunity. We don't know, as you're saying, we don't know if that will be what happens, but I'm going to maybe naively hold on to that hope.
I'm also hoping that too. Yeah.
Look, I think there is something to that. Absolutely. I mentioned the Mousetrap. They're going to be one of the first theatres, mainstream theatres, to explore socially distanced reopening. I think they're going to try and do one every 3 seats. Probably got someone exponentially mapping this out. There's some things that just can't be replicated completely offline, and in particular it's the experience. And I'll go back to the rave research. One of the things I remember trying to as an academic theorized was this thing I kept talking about. It's the vibe. It's the feel of multiple other people being in the same space and time as you. It's the feel of bodies, which we unfortunately probably won't be having too much of, at least with strangers for a while. But it is that shared collective experience. So I share your hope and optimism that perhaps one of the things might happen here is we learn to revalue the experience, the collective experience, as part of this.
Yeah, another thing that I think all of us, are hoping for as well, because we all know how special that is as well. So Susan, we mentioned your current ARC research project in the intro. Do you mind telling us a bit more about that, please?
Absolutely. And this is one itself, it's been disrupted. Everything's in the world of where everything's been disrupted. I did a 3-year ARC research project recently that was talking to craftspeople and designer makers at that sort of time starting in 2015, when all of a sudden the artisanal was just everywhere. And people were really interested in making processes, in the provenance of things, where things came from, were they ethically made, were they sustainably sourced. And so it's mostly looking at people making everything from fashion and design through to more traditional kinds of crafts for sale at places like craft markets, through to your Bowerbird here in Adelaide, or Finders Keepers across most of the East Coast. The current project wants to extend that out, and in some ways wants to bring back arts, crafts and science, technology, engineering, manufacturing, medicine into dialogue. But 150 years ago, across much of the global north, there was an artificial divide when the Industrial Revolution hit between arts and craft as sort of traditional and old school over here, and the anathema, or the other, to industry and manufacturing. This hadn't traditionally been the case. The guilds of, Italian production of glass, and people used to work in small trades and guilds. That model was a much more integrated with manufacturing model. But in much of the English-speaking world, we sort of decided these two are opposed. And so the work I'm doing at the moment is trying to go, no, actually. A lot of people with arts and crafts degrees go off into worlds of work that are outside of what might be traditional arts and crafts. The people that make orthodontics are effectively using craft skills. Prototyping relies upon people who know materials and processes richly, and if we're going to have the dreams of Industry 4.0 realized and innovate and do new things, we need people who know how to do new things, how to build new things out of new materials, or work with old materials in different ways. So it's about trying to bring that picture, broaden out that picture of where these kinds of skills are necessary. And to be honest with you, part of the story here is in our focus in Australia in the last 10, 20 years on the growth of universities, TAFE education and trade skills have become a bit of a second sort of tier, or haven't been given the same kind of focus, or aren't necessarily seen as quite the valued option by many people that perhaps they should be. So it's about trying to also revalue hands-on skills and the needs for skills training, because a lot of the people who have the skills I'm talking about aren't young, and they're not getting any younger. And there's a real risk in our ecosystem, our creative ecosystem, that a lot of the older generations that learnt this hands-on kind of stuff will unfortunately eventually leave us, and leave us without this skills based that we have really relied upon and need to rely upon as we think about lower carbon futures, as we adapt to COVID. And one of the other things that's happening in the making space as a result of COVID is supply chains have been monumentally interrupted. Anyone who tried to buy gym equipment during COVID knows this, but I'm already starting to notice in the craft space, paintbrushes are getting hard to get.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we're going to, and there's also a discussion too, and this is about the geopolitics that's going on behind the scenes between Australia and China and other parts of the world and China. We will see increasingly, a greater discussion of, do we need to bring some making back on shore? I remember the last recession, the pork heating recession we had to have, and that was the moment when a lot of our manufacturing did go offshore, and it finally culminated in things like the closure of car making here in South Australia and Australia more recently. But there was a process that was started during the last recession, and it was part of the last recession. this economic downturn as a result of COVID is actually almost having a return effect of we need to bring a lot more of this home, and we need to start thinking about making things ourselves again and innovating in new ways to think about what we need to make. And if I could just give an example of where craft and these things can come together.
Yeah, sure.
Please.
I hope she doesn't mind. I'm going to refer to a colleague here at UniSA. During the height of, in a nice way, during the height of COVID, we were on Zoom having a discussion, and it's Emily Hilder who heads up the Future Industries Institute here, and
Yeah.
she was involved in for the government looking at PPE equipment and what various characteristics and capacities of those, what was going to work best and what was going to keep the most particles out, that kind of work. And we were having a discussion about precisely how artists and craftspeople and scientists could work together. But just starting that conversation, she had in her hands a mask. And why she liked this mask, she said, was because of the way the folds fitted onto the face. Now, you think about folds and you think about a flat thing that needs to become three-dimensional. That is the kind of skill that everyone from somebody who knows origami through to somebody who sews can bring to the experience of how do you make a good piece of PPE. So you would never necessarily think that someone who was an accomplished sewer or seamstress and somebody who's working in PPE would come together. But we can see in the need to take off and make good quality masks at home as well as generally in society at the moment, one way in which those knowledges are not opposed at all and in fact can feed into one another quite richly.
Yeah, and we had Emily on one of our episodes of Mod TV earlier this year, actually. Yeah, it was really fascinating to hear about that process of, figuring out, supply, but also the design of PPE.
You've done such an amazing job of articulating the cultural divide that we have around the arts and manufacturing and economics, and how that then flows through to its economic and manufacturing realities, and especially for the future. You've laid it out all so perfectly. And we spoke a little bit earlier about our own optimism, but if I could retouch on that theme, do you have anything to tell us about how we can foster optimism in these uncertain times?
This is a really important question for us, and it's one that I especially do feel for younger people in society. It's such a challenging time, but there is there is so much going on that is good or points to the good, and a lot of it points to the good in people. In the arts and cultural sector, a lot of the people I'm speaking to in key organisations, they've been absolutely hammered. They're working really hard and they're trying to protect their people and protect their members and their workers and keep them safe and keep them employed. But one thing they are saying is they actually are optimistic. And I think it's because if nothing else, that turn to arts, culture and creativity that happened, everything from home baking to people doing crafts to the fact that you can't get a paintbrush for love or money in some parts of Adelaide at the moment, to watching streaming stuff online, to music, all this said that the community values arts perhaps in ways that the sector didn't feel the government had been for a long time. And I don't necessarily want to get usually political here, but the Australian arts and cultural sector has been successively defunded for a long period of time here in Australia, and they feel that. And that makes you question your value, and you've been working on the smell of an oily rag, and then this hits. So actually knowing that the people and the community went sought out arts and culture as the thing that they held on to, or to give them joy, to give them meaning, to give them connection to other people. It's been something that's actually given a lot of people in the sector great hope, and great hope that perhaps we can think about ways in which we measure value beyond just its economic contribution, the way in which we can think about, does something make people feel part of a greater whole? Does it make them feel part of the community? Does it give them tools by which to make sense of their own identity and their collective identity? These are all things that you can't capture in money, but are essential to our experience and happiness as human beings. The other thing I will also just say, which is more pragmatic, is that not all parts of the arts and creative sector have necessarily suffered. Most people know one of the things that happened when we all went online was, and especially when JobKeeper and JobSeeker kicked in, there was decent amount of money in the economy, even though a lot of people unfortunately lost their jobs, people shifted their shopping habits to online. So those in my area of craft and design, those people who had shop fronts online or were selling online did really well, because people wanted to go shopping and couldn't go to the shops. So actually, there are parts of the creative sector, especially people selling, fashion online, jewelry online. The Jam Factory, even here, reported a huge surge in online sales, even though their face-to-face shops were closed.
Right.
There were some sectors that were able to hold their own or do okay because the model that we shifted to or pivoted to did work for them. So I think one of the things we do need to do is, while people who do performance have gone online and need to figure out how to monetize that, people who sell physical goods would be well placed to think about how in the future they can move online successfully as a way to try and protect what they do.
And
Absolutely.
I like what you say about how we as a society have turned to arts and culture in this time. And I think that'll be an interesting point going forward, because when we come up to these questions of the value of the arts and creative industries, we can actively ask people, well, what did you do when you couldn't go to work? You watched television shows, you watched movies, you read books, you decided you were going to learn to draw. Like, yeah, hopefully we can retain these lessons going forward.
And it's important to think about this in terms of pipelines too, because something like a major film production or television series takes a while to realize. So the things we're streaming now, we might be watching back catalogues for a while, because there's going to be at least a 6-month hiccup there where not much is getting produced. There's going to be an interesting Academy Awards where there's basically one or two films that are decent. And, it is going to actually feed through. So I suppose one of the important things we need to think about moving forward is, and this is difficult because we are entering a recession, what are we willing to pay for, and how much more are we willing to pay for these things to keep them going? Are we willing to actually go back to paying performers? The mousetrap, we've a third of the audience. Will we be expecting the performers to do 3 more shows a day for the same amount of money? There's a whole lot of challenges there for us as audiences and consumers, as well as the sector and the workers themselves, around what we're willing and able to pay for to support this stuff that we love.
So Susan, with all this fantastic context and like all the possible things we could be thinking about going forward, what do you think is kind of the key question we should be asking ourselves, or asking for, going forward in the next sort of year or so?
Yeah, I think that one is very possibly the key one. There's, I suppose, there's a whole lot of things out there, but the key one will be: are we willing and able to pay more for the things that we take for granted? So I've already given the example of performance and streaming. I'll also go to things like household items and clothes. You can go to Kmart and Target these days and get some fantastically designed stuff really cheap, that comes in en masse. Some of these, the sourcing of some of this material we don't know the provenance of, and a lot of designers, I'm not blaming those particular companies, but just historically have looked at some of the stuff coming in and being produced across the globe en masse and looked and gone, that IP looks very similar to the kind of stuff I've been doing. So there's a long history there of people who hand make and design feeling that they're being undercut by these big companies. So in terms of supporting these economies, it's about, are we willing to pay for talent to perform and for music and blah, 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 and what kind of models will work, what kind of trade-offs. It's also about, and this is tied up with climate change as well and climate futures, how much stuff are we willing to sort of want in the future? Have we had a chance to think about during COVID what really matters? And do we need more stuff? What kind of stuff do we want? That could be one of the questions to ask ourselves moving forward: is this a chance to rethink a lot of those supply chains around stuff, and give thought to where it's made, how it's made, who makes it, and perhaps with a view to buying less but buying better quality. with the same amount of money. So that's another one of the questions I think that can maybe be a good outcome in terms of our need to think about consumption practices as a result, because of climate change, but facilitated by what's happened as a result of COVID.
And just quickly, that reminds me, we spoke with Anna Takia, who's a Melbourne artist, designer, science technology maker, this week, and she's a resident artist at Mod, and looking at objects, household objects, and sentimental objects, and the history and the material processes that go into that. So yeah, that ties in really nicely. I think you're probably interested in
Fantastic.
looking at that. Yeah.
It's about things that we do value as things as well, rather than just having another widget that we throw out when we get bored of that widget.
And knowing where they come from and what is involved, politically, economically, materially. Yeah.
And it's about also, I suppose, just employing our friends and employing ourselves as well. I imagine a lot of people have friends in the arts and cultural sector, and even to an extent manufacturing. So it's about just being willing to try and keep those sectors going locally and as a part of a local economy.
You've given us a lot of things to think about and a lot of things to also be hopeful for. But what is next for you?
Stats. Ironically, I am. I really value field work, and unfortunately, obviously, we can't do much of that in the current time. The project the ARC you spoke about was a national project, as was the previous one, so it was absolutely joyful to be able to go out and talk to makers and speak to them in their studios where they were. We've had to move that online, so what I'll be going back to soon is just finishing off doing some analysis of the statistics that we do have, and one of the ones we've got is degree holders in Australia, what industries they've gone off into. I mentioned that they go off into a lot, and it's not just the ones you think. So it's really tracing those people through. The other thing, the reason I like field work is when I was doing the raves research, too many people were writing about rave who'd never been to one, but had looked in from the outside, and that's never a good way to understand anything, I don't think. So we're getting back to the field work online as much as we can. We'll be using the money that we're saving, and we'll be also saving the planet, which is good in a way, from travel to pay people for their time as a way of acknowledging the fact that they're in a tight financial context at the moment. And rather than us taking the photographs of what they're doing, we're going to be paying local photographers to go and appropriately socially distance, do the photography. So it's about, we've had to pivot to think about how we can do that kind of deep kind of research, but in ways that are both appropriate to COVID, but also acknowledge the sector itself is under strain. So how can we try and give back to that to help support the people who are being generous enough of their time and their stories to talk to us? So that's what I'll be getting back to.
Fantastic. And Susan, if people are interested in finding out more about this this research project or any other work that you're doing or is coming up, where would you suggest we look? Any links you can suggest?
When I'm not doing the research, I'm director of a research group here at UniSA called Creative People, Products and Places, CP3. So I recommend you check out our website. And one of the things that will be going up there before the end of the year is we've currently got a postdoctoral fellow working on specifically a mapping of the impacts of COVID on the sector, but also the governmental policy responses. We're situating the Australian national and state-based responses in a global context, working with colleagues around the world and some partners in the UK as well as, in Europe, as well as some key national organisations here in Australia. So we will be putting up information from that on that website, as well as stuff from the work that I'm doing, as well as my colleagues.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That sounds like a great report.
Wonderful. Well, we could talk about so many things for a very long amount of time, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our conversation. But thank you so much, Susan. We've really appreciated you taking the time to come on our program this afternoon.
It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Susan.